Jinjiwala, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight's NAIDOC Week Yarn, Healing Country, Healing Futures, Aspirations for Country and Community. This event is hosted by the Indigenous Knowledge Institute in partnership with the Faculty of Science at the University of Melbourne. My name is Paris Mordecai. I am a proud Widjabul Waiable Dubai from the Bundjalung Dugon up in northern New South Wales. I am the Indigenous Engagement and Outreach Officer in the Faculty of Science, and I coordinate outreach activities and education programs that aim to engage young mob with science and Indigenous knowledges of country. I am joined today by a panel of esteemed knowledge holders, experts in their fields, passionate and community-driven mob who work across the University of Melbourne. We have Madison Miller, Dr. Nari Blow, Professor Barry Judd, G for Greenway, and Uncle Bruce Pascoe. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge country. I'm excited to be hosting tonight's conversation from my home in beautiful Cavanbar, which translates to meeting place in Bundjalung lingo and is the traditional name for the place of Byron Bay. I would like to acknowledge the Arakwal peoples who are the traditional custodians of Cavanbar and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded and that their connection to, custodianship of, and impact on this country is strong and unwavering. I am blessed to be a guest on the ancestral homelands of the Arakwal peoples, neighbours to my Widjabul Waiable mob. I would like to acknowledge the custodians of the lands on which you are all joining us tonight, and in particular the mobs of Naarm, which is also known as Melbourne today. I would like to extend my respects to all Indigenous peoples present in this space, in particular our fabulous panellists. Their knowledges, their perspectives, stories and experiences remain theirs, and we are very thankful for the opportunity to hear them within this yarning space tonight. NAIDOC Week is an important opportunity to celebrate the histories, cultures and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. For mob, it is a moment to revel, reflect and rest, connect with community and country, celebrate our strength and resilience. While the pandemic allowed me to pause and hear country calling me home, bringing me back to Bundjalung country after years away, for many mob, border closures, lockdowns and social distancing measures have kept mob away from country and away from loved ones. And while some of us may not be able to connect to our countries and communities this NAIDOC, it is bittersweet to be able to connect online and be part of meaningful celebrations and conversations nationwide. For non-Indigenous folk, NAIDOC is an important opportunity to platform and listen genuinely to Indigenous voices, to observe and commit to learning and learning, and we appreciate all non-Indigenous peoples who are joining us tonight. This year's theme, Heal Country, is incredibly pertinent given the assaults on country over the last few years, the destruction of sacred sites, extreme bushfires, droughts and flood. And while this year's theme is a call to action, building on this year's National Reconciliation Week theme as well, it's also a celebration of our beautiful countries, a reminder of our sovereign and custodial responsibilities to country, and a space for us to consider what we as First Nations people aspire for our lands and our communities, and what is needed to create these futures for us. Some general housekeeping before we kick off with our discussion. Our panellists will each introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into some discussion before we open up questions from the audience. You will find below a Q&A function, and we prefer that you submit any questions you may have through that rather than the chat box, which has been disabled. We are recording this evening session and it'll be available for viewing after the event, and we plan to wrap up this around 7:45. But before we begin yarning, I'll invite the panellists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their work. Nari, do you want to kick us off?
No worries, can do. So, Marum Babigi Yoruburiba, my name's Nari. I'm the Director of First Nations Health over at the University of Melbourne in the Melbourne Medical School. And I'd like to, as we're all zooming in and we're all from different countries, I want to acknowledge the country that I'm sitting on. I feel really thankful to be on Yagara and Turrbal land up in Meanjin in Brisbane, and want to acknowledge specifically the elders from this country and the ancestors, particularly during this week, during NAIDOC, and the history that the community has here, particularly around the marches and that are coming up, and a few of the other things that are happening. And I want to also acknowledge the Wurundjeri, the Bunurong and the peoples of the Kulin Nation, because that is, of course, where the work that I do is, it's the land that I'm on when I'm doing that work. So I want to acknowledge that and also pay my respects to those elders, particularly a lot of them that have guided me on my journey on that land growing up in Melbourne. As well, I'd like to just talk to and acknowledge the First Nations leadership at the university, and particularly the leadership around the theme of this year and Heal Country and what our communities have been doing to protect country and also to support each other and our families. And lastly, I'd like to acknowledge all the mob here and just say that thank you again for inviting me, and acknowledge that always was and always will be Aboriginal land and sovereignty is yet to be ceded. And of course, as any type of acknowledgement goes, it's always a bit long because there's always so many important parts of our community, our country, our land, our waterways, our skies that are important to acknowledge as before to acknowledge where we come from when we're talking. So I was just going to just cover a little bit of some of the work that I do at the university. And so I might share my slides as well before we begin the panel discussion. I'll just put that on. Okay, so I assume everyone can see that. Thumbs up. Yeah, thanks. So I'd like to acknowledge, I come from a position, I've talked about the land and country that I've come from. So, and that's where that's where I reside, but essentially the communities that I come from are from the Quandamooka people of the Ngunnawal Nation, which is on Minjerribah and also known as North Stradbroke Island, and also Gurungurring country up in Bundaberg, Queensland. And also acknowledged my connections on my mother's side, which are the Yorta Yorta people of Shepparton. And essentially, when I bring my lens into health and medicine as a public health physician, I bring that knowledge that comes from those communities and that culture. When we talk about health, though, or medicine in specifically, it often doesn't really have a First Nations lens and definitely doesn't have a localized lens. And so a big part of the work that I've been doing at the university has been bringing a First Nations health lens and those Indigenous knowledges into the teaching of the social determinants of health. And I'll tell you a little bit about why I focus on social determinants as well. So first, I just want to talk about a First Nations lens for health and wellbeing, and talk a little bit about the different communities around what we now call Australia. So there are lots of different terms that have been used for health and wellbeing for different communities, and they all have their own meanings. And of course, the meaning is much more complex than just health. So as you can see here, there's a couple of examples. Down the bottom right there, it's Narajara. That is actually the Woiwurrung language word, which is around health and wellbeing. And that's something that I've had a lot of discussions with Arnie Dai Kerr and some of the Wurundjeri women that I've had the privilege of getting to know. And really that concept around health is not just about physical well-being, but it's also about emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being as well. And there are other terms that are used around the country. Talkaya is actually a term from the Muddy Muddy community along the river. And again, that term is not just about well-being, but it's about this holistic concept of health and well-being. And then Ngangkari are the traditional healers from the APY land between what we call Northern Territory and South Australia now, who are very much about spiritual healing and healing that comes through ancestors and spirits. And then there are other terms used in other communities. Wallenwin is a Wiradjuri word. Nanglani is from Broome, and then Kalinya is one of my mother's words, which is Yorta Yorta language, which essentially means good or whole, and also beautiful. And essentially what you'll notice is that not one of these terms means absence of disease, which is often how medicine and health is taught, or particularly when I went to medical school. And actually there's been, I guess, a universal definition around health and well-being, which has been used with NACCHO, meaning not just, again, the physical well-being of an individual, but refers to the social, emotional, and cultural well-being of a whole community, in which each individual is able to achieve their full potential as human beings, thereby bringing about total well-being of their community. And I think these definitions are really important because they're not the particular definitions that have traditionally been taught at universities in regards to health and well-being. So we know that the unifying factor for a lot of communities around well-being is this idea of holistic care. And holistic care means that everything around you affects your health and well-being. So that includes your environment, that includes what's happening in society, that includes the language, the songs you sing, the ways you practice, the ways you behave, the way you connect with people around you. And this is, I guess, traditionally been referred to as the social determinants of health by a lot of institutions. And this idea of social determinants of health, I guess, has been defined by the World Health Organization globally. And it tends to mean this idea that, you know, employment, education, housing, access, all has an effect on health. And so I wanted to kind of bring these two concepts together around this idea of holistic care or First Nations health lens into the social determinants of health when teaching community, when teaching about community lenses for medical students and other health professionals. So the thing that's often missing when describing social determinants of health, and this is actually a picture from the Aboriginal Canadian Council, is there isn't often a discussion around culture more generally, specifically around colonisation and the effects on health, around racism bias. Everyone shies away from this topic and doesn't tend to talk about the real implications, both physically and mentally, of racism on healthcare. Around self-determination, often social determinants are deficit-based about the things that affect us and have poor health outcomes, but not positively. So self-determination, when we see self-determination, there's multiple studies around this, we see more positive health outcomes for communities. And then, of course, the justice system and systemic barriers, which we're now starting to have those discussions, and we talk about you know, Black Lives Matter and all the protests that have been happening recently, and talking about incarceration rates and also health outcomes. And lastly, land rights, which often doesn't get discussed, which then links in with how we treat our country and our land, which really does fit in with what we're talking about this week around country. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but essentially we've come up with a few new teaching models which try to incorporate a lot of this teaching around this holistic well-being for multiple different communities, and that First Nations lens on the social determinants of health. And this is just one depiction of how we teach it. We also have, I guess, a river sort of type model, which we use, where we have the positive and negative effects of social determinants of health. And we also use it as a teaching tool in regards to a bit of a flow chart and being able to sort of use that in teaching and case studies. What we've also included in a lot of these designs is these conversations and discussions, specifically with Wurundjeri community, of which majority of our campuses and our hospitals that these students will end up working in is on. And actually, I'm really excited, but we're soon to launch a new version of these models that actually has artwork specifically around Wurundjeri story and actually uses Woiwurrung language throughout. But I really just wanted to do a quick overview around the work and research we've been doing has all been centered around First Nations knowledge and leadership. And so that is making sure that we have a localized context, and we are talking to all those elders and communities from Kulin Nations, of which, you know, as I said, majority of our work and what we do and where our hospitals sit and a lot of the health services that our students end up working in sit, and also doing some work with some of the rural schools as well, and working specifically with Yorta Yorta Nation, also Jaja and I can't remember that last one, I've just blanked. Oh no, it's still Yorta Yorta because that's Wangara. So we've been working, I guess, alongside community to incorporate First Nations health within this concept of health and wellbeing. And the reason that we're doing it at the university is that a lot of what we do when we're teaching students, we are shaping future health professionals. And a lot of this does end up translating into healthcare. And what we've seen, if I use COVID-19 pandemic as an example, because that is what I do when I'm not working at the university, I work specifically on the outbreak response and in regards to the vaccination program, is that actually First Nations communities have been leading the way with this pandemic. First Nations communities were the first one to see previous experience and use what happened in the H1N1 influenza pandemic and actually use those same successful strategies in this pandemic in terms of making sure community were really aware of all the health promotion messages really early on, making sure that community had the local support, making sure that there was resources, food, accommodation, etc. for those that had to isolate. There was communication and collaboration straight away. A lot of it was run by community-controlled health organisations. There was a lot of culturally informed strategies, and then those health promotion campaigns were really rapidly set up. And so what we've seen is really, really low rates of COVID-19 in the community, which was not expected at all, because if we look at social determinants of health in our communities, we were much more likely to be affected by COVID-19. And that is because we've been incorporating Indigenous knowledges into the work and how we protect and look after our communities. So that's a little bit of an overview of what I've been doing and why I think it's really important that we have First Nations leadership and we have First Nations communities actively involved in health and wellbeing, not just understanding it, but in preventing health issues and also promoting good healthcare, and then also promoting good care, therefore, of country and land. So I think I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. And thank you to my co-panelists. It's great to see you all here. My name's Barry Judd. I'm Director and Professor of the Indigenous Studies program in the Faculty of Arts. Leading Indigenous studies, we don't really deal with Indigenous knowledges, but I have a very close relationship to the IKI and am currently working on a Centre of Excellence proposal with them, which is focused on Indigenous knowledges, so directly addresses issues of country. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you this evening from the country of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to all the peoples of the Kulin Confederation. And at this time, really thank two important people, Annie Joy Murphy and Annie Carolyn Briggs, who are people who have always made me feel welcome in this part of the continent. Look, I'm not going to talk too much about my work, but I'm going to reference a trip that I made several years ago in Central Australia, which really speaks to country and the concept of country, as I understand, it requires people to enact it, to make it real, to make it viable. And the story I wanted to tell you is about what happens when that's not possible. So bear with me. This may seem off track, but hopefully you pull something out of this. A couple of years ago, I took a trip down the Anbadell and Connie Sue tracks in outback South Australia. I travel with an old friend I had known since the 1990s when I first worked at the University of Melbourne. We set off as a convoy of two in British 4x4s and as people who proudly identify as descendants of Aboriginal peoples of Central Australia. Me, Pidindara, and he, Yunkindara. The many ironies of this did not escape us. As people who had been regular visitors to Central Australia since our childhoods, we wanted to cross the Anbadell and Connie Sue for the peace that isolation in the arid inland provides. We wanted to traverse country and we wanted to make camp along the way, new ways following well-worn paths, perhaps. Yet my other motivation for this holiday lay in the darker history of the tracks as service roads for the British nuclear test programs of the 1950s. Now these tracks are celebrated by Anglo-Australia as important places for remote area 4x4 touring adventures, but no one seems to talk about or acknowledge the original purposes of these tracks and others like them that traverse the interiors of the Australian continent. At a place called Emu Field in the Great Victoria Desert, South Australia, a British nuclear weapon called Totem 1 was detonated on the 15th of October, 1953. The detonation of Totem 2 followed 2 weeks later on the 27th of October. For me, being at these sites made thinking deep and hard about the ongoing consequences of colonialism, settler state nationalism, and Australia's entanglement in the folly of British imperial dreams unavoidable. But for the inscribed blocks of concrete that mark ground zero, one might not know that the lands at Emu were poisoned with so much radiation that they will remain of limited use to Aboriginal peoples who claim ownership of the plains for many millennia to come. Signs in Pidindara inform local people that while Malu or red kangaroo is safe to eat, Nura or camp or home remains unsafe. This is colonial dispossession every day and today. Totems turned from purposeful dreamings into inexplicable nightmares, seemingly without end. Beyond the undeniable colonial dispossession of Emu Field, the power of settler state nationalism and its continued operation across Central Australia is manifest in small acts of frontier violence that have become so embedded in Anglo-Australian culture that represent the normal order of things. While visiting the site of an old plane wreck 40 kilometres from the Pidindara-owned roadhouse at Elkirka in Western Australia, a group of old white men from Perth informed us as a matter of fact that the remote Aboriginal community of Warburton was a dangerous and violent place. As they proceeded to warn us that if we didn't watch our vehicles while refueling, all our gear that wasn't bolted down would go walkabout. One old man turned to my young daughter, Tilly, and pointed towards her. They'll steal her too if you don't watch her. About 200 kilometres from Warburton, down the Connie Sue track, we met another old white man. This one carried a large hunting knife. He strongly encouraged us to take a sidetrack close by to see a beautiful deep waterhole populated by the most zebra finches or nyinyi you will see. Given that our permits clearly specified that travel along the side tracks was off limits, we were hardly surprised that the sidetrack in question was clearly marked by the Nunanjara Land Council signs declaring the waterhole a sacred site and outsiders permitted no right of access. That this message from the local land council had been shot through multiple bullet holes speaks to the continued disrespect and disregard for Aboriginal people's claims of ownership to their lands and their sacred places. The persistent power of Anglo-Australian narratives of nation and of national belonging and exclusion continue to make it so. And I'll just end with this because it's kind of a funny story to end things, but it again speaks to the relationship between contemporary Aboriginal people who I know and country. At the camp that night, with the Great Central Road within reach, our thoughts turned to the idea of an ice-cold beer and how we might gain access as we move closer to Uluru and the resort town of Yulara. With alcohol only available to those staying at the Yulara resort and our preference for bush camping, we started serious deliberations on an elaborate scheme to get grog into our camp. I was meeting a PhD student at Yulara, and it was decided I should call him on a satellite phone to request a slab and arrange a place and time for the transaction to be completed. After about half an hour of planning, we looked at each other and laughed. I said, now we know what the everyday is like for family who live on remote communities where alcohol is not permitted. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Barry. That was beautiful. I might pass over to Maddie, who's joining us from Corranderk today.
Thanks, Paris. And if I turn into a robot, I'm really sorry. I've got pretty patchy internet out here. But today I'm Maddie Miller. I'm a Daruk woman, Wamuli Jin. I am joining you from beautiful Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country at Corranderk. Corranderk was an Aboriginal station where Aboriginal people from all over the southeast were brought, and they farmed hops and many other crops here. And it's also one of the places that was incredibly impacted by the so-called Half-Caste Act. And I'm here tonight meeting with beautiful Wurundjeri Woiwurrung mob to talk about food sovereignty. And I've my NAIDOC week has been quite nice. It's, in my car, so sorry. But it's been a great opportunity to catch up with a lot of people. For once, Melbourne's not the place in lockdown. So my role at the university is quite new. I'm quite new to the university. My background is as an archaeologist, and I worked in government for 8 or so years as an archaeologist there. And I've come in as a research fellow looking at ecological knowledges of country. And to me, ecological knowledge is not really a thing. I think that our knowledges are so intertwined that to pull them apart, much like Nari was talking about, that our health and the health of country are so intertwined that they can't be siloed in the way in which knowledge is siloed in university structures. So it's great to see so many wonderful people from different parts of the university, but we all have common ground in our work. And I'll leave it there because I want to hear from Uncle Bruce and Jeefa. But thanks.
Thank you so much, Maddie, and we appreciate you zooming in, and hope you're comfy in your car. I apologise for that, but I will pass over to Jeefa if you want to tell us a little bit about you and your work.
Thank you. I'll share the screen initially. I'm a visual person. Bear with me. So thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be contributing to this conversation, and I think it's really timely in the context of where we're at the moment. Certainly, I'd like to acknowledge that I am located on the unceded sovereign lands of the Kulin Nation, pay respects to Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and really acknowledge that they have been the custodians of this place for millennia and have certainly protected and stewarded the land for many thousands of generations. My mob is Wawong Gamilaroi country, northwest New South Wales. And importantly, I bring, I guess, a bicultural experience in the context of my conversation. And it's always important to acknowledge the trailblazers and the warriors who've come before. So my late father, Bert Groves, was born 6 years after Federation. And so he was an important figure in Aboriginal history in that he was at that sort of vanguard of Aboriginal activism from the 20s through to particularly the 60s and 70s. And at the moment, there is a lot happening within the built and natural environment. We have bored through country. We have also scarred country and blown up country. We have burnt and damaged the country, particularly its interface with flora and fauna. We have fenced country, particularly evident in the missions and reserves which were dotted across the continent. And we have also have the blood of our people on country as it relates to that colonial interface and some of the very challenging experiences of Indigenous people, particularly on my country, Gamilori country, where there's an intensification of an experience where the residual effects are still rippled through to this very day. And importantly, truth-telling is part of healing country. And so part of the role of the work that I do is really about looking at the role and the contribution of the built and natural environments and indigenising curriculum through design education particularly, but also as a practitioner, as an architect by training. And this quotation for me, I think, captures it quite nicely. If nothing of your culture, history, language or art is visible in the streets, parks and buildings where you live, how can you ever feel welcome there? And so the map in the bottom right-hand corner is the earliest iteration of a map of Melbourne. And importantly, what we see here is a significant and rich biodiversity and landscape of mountain ranges, of wetlands, of a great lake, understood to be the Kakadu of the South, of important sites, important song lines and stories and connections and tracks which traverse through this landscape. And interestingly, in recent times, we've come to a point of I guess, a historical reckoning of how we start to engage with contested histories and how we start to acknowledge the deeper connections to country. And so part of the work that I do is really about starting to interrogate what that means. And importantly, in the context here in Victoria, we have legislated for treaty conversations. We have a First Peoples Assembly. We have recently announced a Truth and Justice Commission. And what that presupposes for the built and natural environment is a new way of working, or a sort of a challenging of the standard ways in which we've engaged with the environment, and how we start to pivot to this new reality on the horizon. And the built and natural environment professions will need to adapt and change to understand and to embed some of these considerations. And I am strongly of the belief that Indigenous designers, Black design really matters in terms of telling our stories our way. And certainly there is a means and an opportunity to start to engage with the deep and abiding knowledge systems which are connected to the rich mosaic that is Indigenous Australia. And part of this really goes back to where we're from and who's our mob and where our country exists. And this symposium that I convened a few years back here at the University of Melbourne, titled Go Back to Where You Came From. And it was a provocation to really understand and engage and connect to our deep layers of history and memory of place. And importantly, this embrace of the knowledge systems of understanding, for instance, the rich biodiversity of our bioregion in which we're located and the projects which we undertake, and drawing upon language of the rhythms of country, of the connections to flora and fauna, and understanding the interconnectedness and the relationality to country. And importantly, the work that I do seeks to understand that it's more than exotic plumage, as Richard Franklin often describes it. It's more than a mural on the wall. It's more than a bush tucker garden in a landscape. It's really about starting to understand how we can infuse within the DNA of our thinking connections to Indigenous culture. And one project that we've been working on in recent years is the new student precinct here at the University of Melbourne on the Parkville campus. And part of this work is really about making the invisible visible, of telling the stories of country, of understanding that the river of no sound that exists and traverse through this campus, we need to give a voice to, and understanding that that country is speaking to us. The connections to the eel migration that traverses through the stormwater system under the campus is telling us something, and it becomes a mechanism of how we can really engage and delve deep. And the stories and the narratives of country exist even when we concrete over country in a really major metropolis like Melbourne. And some of the projects that we do, and I'm blessed with the fortunate scenario of undertaking projects on virtually every state and territory. And this particular project, located on the Great Australian Bight in Ceduna, is really looking at how we listen to the custodians, listen to the three distinct language groups of this particular project, and to embed that and start to tell the stories. And in this instance, we're trying to evoke from the desert to the sea as part of the driving narrative, which informs and provides design inspiration. And what's particularly encouraging is the built environment disciplines are now understanding that we operate within a social license and a social contract, and it comes with certain obligations and responsibilities. We can see now that there is an acute emergency. There is an understanding that there is risk to the biodiversity. Climate change is impacting on the built and natural environment. And part of this is really about understanding that when we start to think about things like sustainability, that is at its essence caring for country. And by starting to understand how we can go about going towards net zero and starting to think about the roles and the contribution of Indigenous voice and knowledge as starting to be part of the solution. And as Arnie Dai Kerr often says in her welcomes, if you care for country, it will in turn care for you. Yana, go well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jifa. I think your insights and understandings of the built environment are particularly interesting and pertinent given our context for many of us in inner city Naarm, and how we connect and imagine country in those spaces. So thank you so much for sharing, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about that further on in the discussion. And finally, Uncle Bruce, I'm sure many on this webinar tonight are familiar with you and your work, but if you could please give us a little bit more insight into what you're up to, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Oh, Uncle, you're just on mute. There we go.
Thank you very much for the welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to be here during this week and to be with my brothers and sisters. Paris, thank you for running the session, and I hope you are going well with your studies. Nari, long time since we've seen each other, but I really admire your work, and I'm proud of what you do. And Maddie, your work is very important to me at the moment, and we had that little yarn a while ago now about the importance of our people claiming the right to talk about our people. Barry, thanks for the yarn about your travels. Always really important to Aboriginal people to move across country, move through other people's country and do it with respect. And Jill, talking about the eels, very important. The eels are still trying to follow their law, follow their way in the world. And they're invisible, but they won't always be invisible. And it's like us. You know, our stories may be hidden, submerged, suppressed, but that's not going to be the case forever. Even though there are a lot of people who resent the idea that our people will be able to tell story, it's inevitable, because story never dies. If you can whisper into the ear of your baby, the story is alive. And I'm on down here on Yuin land. You know, part of my family is Yuin, and I'm on the southernmost point of Yuin country. And this is the meeting of three salt rivers, the Maramingo, the Wallagara, and the Jinor. And they all of those streams reach back way up north, and each of them follows our people's paths back into the high country, where we ate moth and where we celebrated each other, celebrated the moth, celebrated the health that it gave us, celebrated the opportunity to be with each other. And so when we say Jinor, which means the foot, it doesn't mean foot. It means the track to our old cultural law. And my town, Jinor, has been italicized to Genoa, the Italian city, because people were unsatisfied with the Aboriginal past. And that is evident today, that if we assert ourselves and our right to our story, right to our culture, right to our country, there are still some who will try to suppress our right to do so. But things are changing, and I don't think the extreme reactionary right are aware of how dramatically things are changing. And perhaps their thrashing about and screaming is an indication that they know the game is up. I think young Australians want to know about the history. They want to know the Aboriginal story, because they know that that story is Australian story. That is Australian history, and that is part of their history, and they want to know it. They don't want to be separated from it. They don't want to deny it. They don't want to be triumphal about having disposed of that old culture. They want to know it. And I think we need to accept that offer. As Aboriginal people, we need to reach out and say, as Di Kerr said so beautifully at my grandchildren's school only a few months ago, you are welcome to these leaves. You are welcome to the country. But that welcome also comes with responsibility. You just don't get given the land. And that's where Batman, when he established the settlement at Melbourne, he was distorting the offer made to him deliberately, so that he was in a contest with the British Crown to take up the land in Victoria. So he distorted the offer, the generosity of the old people, and fabricated a map and a form of words to indicate that the people had given him the land. Those old people hadn't given him the land. They had welcomed him to enjoy the land. And that welcome's still open. We do it every day. And there are enough Australians now who understand what a welcome is, understand what reciprocity is, and understand what responsibility is. And I'm very confident that we are entering a new and more amenable world for our people. But it comes at a time when the world may end. First time in the history of humans, the world may end. So all of us, as Nari mentioned earlier, all of us have this extra responsibility now of buying enough time to save the globe. We all have to get involved with that. We can't turn our backs on it and say, oh, look, I'm only interested in Aboriginal sovereignty, because that is not going to save us alone. We have to save Mother Earth. And I think we can talk to a vast majority of Australians and say, she is our mother. We come from her, we'll go back to her. And if she dies, we die. And we should be saying to the businessman, you know, the smart man with his 2 Ferraris or whatever they are, you know, I've probably Mr. March in whatever the most expensive car is, and I don't care. But so this man with his 2 rich cars, we might say to him in a very friendly voice, and genuinely friendly, because he's a human and we must love this man. We say, my brother, is that all? As Peggy Lee, a singer that no one here will ever remember, is that all there is to Ferrari? When in fact, what you're doing is you are denying your great-grandchildren. Do you hate them? Those little unborn babies, do you hate them? Because you are denying them a future. And I think we can instill in students coming through Melbourne University's business school, their commerce department, we can instill in those people this sense of responsibility for the globe. It's not anti-science, it's not anti-dollar, it's not anti-democracy, or it's not anti-capitalism. It's about love. Love of the earth and our desire, our fervent desire that our great-grandchildren will have a land that they can live on comfortably and pass on to their next generation. Do we want to finish before the sun does? That's leaving the party early, eh? Anyway, I'm on the wonderful Yuin land where all these rivers join, the Maramingo, the Wallagara, the Jinua. And it is dark here now. Grandmother Moon is just a slice in the sky. But Grandfather Sun will be here in the morning, and I will be there to welcome Grandfather and to thank Grandfather and to thank Grandmother for the joy of being alive. And on this land here, southern edge of Yuin land, Yuin people work here on the old grains, the old tubers, the old salad vegetables. And every week, every day, we try and remind ourselves that this is not just work. This is not just food. Remind ourselves of what old Uncle Max Harrison says to us all the time when he's down here. We didn't have medicines. Our foods were our medicines. We ate well and we were well. And it's a really important thing to say to the world today. Eat well. Don't eat too much. Don't make too many demands on the earth. And I'm a meat eater, bless my rotten socks, but I am learning to eat less meat because we have to. We cannot afford to grow herds, and we cannot afford the sheep to be more populous than people, because we are, with that animal, particularly the sheep, we are destroying the globe. So we need to eat more vegetables, like our old people, 80% vegetable diet. And on the farm out here, we've got our myrtle, and we've got Bourbon lily. We've got the beautiful chocolate lily and the vanilla lily. All of these tubers, they're perennial. You don't plant them like turnips and then rip them out of the ground. You plant them, you leave them. They'll be there forever. And you lift them up every now and then and say, hello, I'm going to take this one, I'm going to take that one. Push that plant back into the ground. Press her face back with the mother and she will grow again. And, you know, I've been taken to task for talking about agriculture, the word agriculture, because that's a word that is obviously reserved for Europeans. And we would be impertinent to take that word of our own. I don't care if it's agriculture. I don't care whether it's horticulture. What I care about is it is sustainable food production. We're not supposed to have language for anything like organised food production, but we do, because the very words are about food production. Someone here tonight mentioned Darug. From my knowledge of Darug people, it means yam daisy. The people call themselves a yam. How much more reverent can you be of that food production? So we have to resist the desire of a very minor group of Australians now to dumb down our culture. We have to resist the desire of those people to eliminate our culture. We have to embrace those young Australians who want to know about their country, want to know about their history, and we have to welcome them to it. Old Uncle Max Harrison, I mentioned him before, he says, if we are to keep our culture, we have to give it away. If we are to keep our culture, we have to give it to people who are non-Aboriginal. And this is the greatest act of generosity that I can imagine. And I think it's really potent that, and Tony Birch, he barracks for Carlton, but he's still okay. Tony Birch has always said to me, and we've discussed it a lot over 20 odd years, that we cannot afford to have Australians not in love with their country, because if they don't love their country, they're restless spirits. So they will be the Peter Duttons. They will be the industrialist who pollutes the river. They will be the engineer who blows up Juukan Gorge. We cannot afford to have these people not in love with their country. So if we want them to love their country, we have this gift, which is knowledge of country. We can give that to them and say, here, this is a gift, but it comes with the most responsibility that anyone can ever hold, because it's about Mother Earth. It's about your relationship. You skinny white fella, it is your relationship with Mother Earth. We are giving that to you. We want you to have it. We don't want you to be a restless spirit. And NAIDOC Week this year, Healing Country, we're not just healing country, we're healing people. We really are healing people with this offer of love. And, you know, it sounds kind of pathetic, I know, to some people to even include the word love in a sentence. And, you know, I can see people shrink from it sometimes when I say it. When I say the words Mother Earth, scientists, you know, groan. When I talk about love, I know that the pragmatists cringe. get over your groaning and cringing, because this is really what it's all about. And we cannot talk about our country without talking about those things. And I know this from my law on Yuin country. When we climb Gulaga Mountain, walk up that sacred mountain and go through the law, it's all about women. It's all about babies. And there is not one weapon mentioned. Some men, and they are decreasing in number, find that disappointing. But this is the new world. And this new world is going to be Mother Earth world. It'll be an Aboriginal world, I believe. And my grandchildren are on the farm tonight. Blazing red hair, most of them. But black in their soul, black in their heart, black in their intent.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for your deeply insightful words. It's always a pleasure to hear from you and hear about your experiences and your learnings. So we might get stuck into some questions. We don't have a lot of time, so if the audience would like to submit any questions, please do as we are speaking. But I mean, I'll start with this question. This year's theme, Heal Country, is a call for the nation to embrace First Nations knowledge systems and their deeply contextual understandings of country and see them as fundamental to addressing our environmental concerns. How do we shift public perception of Indigenous knowledges of country from ancient and archaic to innovative and future focused? Jifa, would you like to start on that one?
Sure, it's a big question. I think it starts with acknowledging that Indigenous culture is a lived culture, constantly changing, adapting and evolving. And you would not have lasted on this harsh continent for over 3,000 generations without that ability to adapt and to change. And once we start to change the conversation to acknowledge and embrace that reality, then we can start to delve deeper and understand that there are sophisticated knowledge systems which have engaged with country for so long. And if we look at, for instance, the Budj Bim cultural landscape, predates the pyramid, estimated to be 6,600 years old, using the volcanic eruption and the lava stone to create the sophisticated eel traps and to capture aquatic life, to create permanent settlements, to create stone housing, which have very much responded to country. The last time I was down there, for instance, it was blowing a gale, it was raining cats and dogs, and a lot of these permanent settlements, estimated to be anywhere between 400 and 1,000 people strong. What you see, and it's revealing itself through bushfire, actually, these settlements more and more, is how carefully modulated and responsive these settlements were to country, because they actually turned their back on the prevailing winds. They harnessed the embodied energy and the thermal mass of the lava stone to create the stone houses. And that is just emblematic of that sophisticated knowledge and understanding and the ability to read country. And so once we start to engage with these sort of conversations and reveal and make those sort of connections to history, we can start to understand that we have a role to play. And ultimately, we're using all the sophisticated tools that everybody else is using. But in the hands of Indigenous people and through Indigenous design thinking in the hands of creatives, we can actually be part of the solution and start to engage deeply with our responsibilities.
Thank you so much, Jifa. And I know for myself, I'm working on a Indigenous education program, and we are, implementing Indigenous design thinking to get non-Indigenous students to start thinking in ways that MOB have been thinking for millennia. And it's really quite exciting to see the change and the transformation with some of these students thinking. It's really fantastic, and I'd love to see more of it. Would anyone else like to respond to that question? Nari?
Yeah, I might jump in there just because, you know, a lot of what Jeef is saying is exactly, I guess, the philosophy that we have when we're teaching students who are in the health professions, because we really want to make sure that these students understand that this westernized medicine, or this westernized way of doing health and treating people, actually comes from a long line of learning from First Nations knowledges. And there are so many examples out there. I mean, you even think about, you know, the physical examples around the actual medicines we give out, and a lot of that coming from a lot of the knowledge around plant medicines here. And when you acknowledge, you know, traditional knowledge, a lot of it can relate to so many facets of health and well-being. And I just think about, you know, I think about my traditional medicine and what I've been taught, and what's been handed down from my father, and which has been handed down from his, you know, grandmother and grandfather, is, you know, when we look at our traditional medicine, our gumby, that actually is multiple different plants and multiple different trees. But if you just took the leaves off that one tree, say whether that's Gajeri parviflora or Pittosporum angustifolium, it actually doesn't actually have any medicinal properties if that tree is standalone on its own. But if that tree is around other trees that actually nourish the tree and bring, I guess, those aspects of the environment together to create those healing properties, and their access to resources, then we see that we can actually make these medicines out of these plants. And the same goes for when you're handing out pills for patients in a healthcare setting. You know, that pill alone is not going to be the thing that's going to treat an illness or, you know, some kind of issue with your health. It needs to be that medicine, but it also needs to be, you know, that support, those resources, that community around you. And all of those concepts are already there. They've already been told by so many communities and so many stories. And that's just one, you know, physical aspect. You think about, you know, this idea around mindfulness and meditation, which has been coined by science because there's been a lot of, you know, MRI studies and a lot of sort of imaging that looks at the brain and how it responds. But then you can also just go back and listen to stories from elders around the dairy and the practice of listening and being still. And all of these are already there, and they've already been there for a long time. And that's kind of my passion, is actually just getting students and community, non-Indigenous and Indigenous, because we're learning from each other in our own different nations and communities, to see that a lot of this comes from these knowledges already. And if we can respect and understand that, like Uncle Bruce said, and like, you know, Ani Dyer said, it is a gift that is given, but it has some responsibility around it as well.
Thanks so much. It really speaks to what both you and Maddie were speaking about earlier in your introductions around how Indigenous knowledge systems are so holistic and so interrelated. All of you MOB are working across different faculties, but have often the same objectives or the same, you know, are speaking from the same principles. And I think that's something that a lot of MOB who work within universities struggle with, is the way that knowledge is siloed and the barriers that presents for us who do want to work from our own systems and our own ways of doing and seeing. And it's a challenge that I think a lot of us are starting to tackle in ways that we can transform this place to make our, you know, our work have more impact. Barry or Bruce, do you either have any comments to add to that question? No? That's all right. We can pass on to the next question. This one kind of speaks to Jeef around your work, but I'm sure you all have some insights around it. And it's around the way that we understand the concept of country. And often non-Indigenous people equate country with existing outside of cities and outside of urban areas, and thus when are presented with this idea of caring for country are quite confused by how that equates to their situation and their context. So what role does the built environment, both existing and future infrastructure, have in creating healthy country?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it goes back to just calling out the reality that Indigenous people have manipulated the landscape for human habitation. So we were the first ecologists, we were the first architects, we were the first engineers. And so this is not new territory. So, you know, often we sort of privilege Western knowledge over all other forms of knowledge. And, you know, ultimately the built and natural environment are the things that we most viscerally connect to. They are the interior spaces, the dwellings, the universities, the parks and landscapes that we create. But ultimately, I think, you know, the sort of sustainable practices which are sort of just assumed and embedded as it relates to Indigenous lens is kind of a given. You know, we don't, you know, I don't use the word sustainability in my practice. Essentially, caring for country is an act and is a behaviour, as opposed to a sort of an afterthought or a sort of grafted solution upon a project or a building, for instance. And so the idea of caring for country is essentially saying that why would you spoil or in any way damage Mother Earth, as Uncle Bruce well puts it. And, you know, this becomes really just a way of engaging in respectful relationships with the country in which we so rely. And so that symbiotic relationship and understanding the interconnectedness. And it starts with the notion of respect. And that is at its essence, really. And so in the built and natural environment, you know, we can't take more than we have. And that is just an understanding and an acknowledgement of the finite resources that we have. And I think that there has been a mentality that we can extract from country, we can take from country, we can, you know, fell country. But we've got to a tipping point now where unless we make some dramatic changes, we're going to get to a point where we can't repair country. And ultimately now is the time to remediate, repair, restore country. And not only in a physical sense, you know, the work around language reclamation is a process of healing country in many respects. Engaging with Indigenous knowledge can often be the mechanism to heal country. So we can see and understand that interrelationship and the fact that everything has a connection. And, you know, you take out one piece of the puzzle and it will have a knock-on effect to other elements that we may not have even considered.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'd like to add to that if I could. And Kirsten, I saw your question and I'm going to get around to it, but what Jifa was saying about Abuj Bim, my daughter was there a few days ago, and she was saying how important it was for her and her children just to see the beauty of that country. And as Jifa said, those old people built their houses with their backs to the bad weather. And I remember being there 4 or 5 years ago and walking along a path and seeing an old house, you know, demolished now, but on a bend of the river where your jaw drops with the beauty and the peace and the beautiful design on that bend of the river, where if you walked along that path coming home that night, your heart would beat so rapidly because you're coming home. This is a very human response. And like I said before, there are people who do not want us to have this response to country. because if Australians begin to identify with country and not with real estate, then capitalism is in real trouble. Now, there is incredible resistance going on now to Aboriginal rights and heritage, and it's being directed by people who I believe despise Aboriginal people, and they want us to forget our culture. The whole aim of it is for us to forget our culture. But what is happening in the state of Victoria at the moment is elders right across the state are working with government toward treaty. I believe this will be the first state where it will happen. And we are the only country in the world, a colonised country in the world, that doesn't have a treaty. And we are edging closer to it in Australia at the moment. And land rights come with treaty. Maybe constitutional change comes with it as well, but I don't care what you call it, as long as it happens. And the beautiful Uluru Statement that our gracious old people made only a few years ago, knocked back at lunchtime by the most liberal of liberal prime ministers, was such a modest statement. And Australians are reading it and reading it and reading it and understanding that this might be an anthem for Australia. And there are people who don't want that. They don't want treaty. They don't want land rights. They don't want an anthem for Australia. And we have to be aware that when one of our brothers and sisters is being kicked, we are all being kicked. And we have to resist the will of those who are deniers of country, who only see a bank, only see real estate, can't see a river for its water, can't see a forest for its trees, only see money. We have to resist that. We have to tell and tell and tell our children that it's all about country. And, you know, it's quite right that, as Kirsten is alluding to, that we have to fight this political fight as well as the cultural right. And Jeepa was saying about language before. All of our history is in our language. You know, the environmental care is in our language. It's there, and we can share it with other people. But coming with that sharing is a responsibility. And I think a lot of Australians are taking armfuls of responsibility. And that is what is stirring up the far right, because they can see a time when the Uluru Statement will be our hymn. They can see a time when people will flock to the polling booth to put the tick beside the yes vote for treaty. And they don't want that. So we have to encourage the good-hearted Australian. We have to reach out to the good-hearted Australian and say, we will support you. We, Aboriginal people, will support you, the non-Aboriginal people, to look after Mother Earth. It's a dual citizenship for all of us.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for that. I do have another question here that's in the Q&A, and I'm just going to try and articulate it a little bit. It's around how do you non-Indigenous peoples, sorry, one second, I'm just trying to, it's quite a lengthy question. So what responsibility do settler Australians have to care for country, and what are the best ways that non-Indigenous Australians can access information and knowledges of country? I think that kind of encapsulates it. Barry, do you have any thoughts on that, how we may best share knowledges of country with non-Indigenous people?
Well, I mean, one of the issues, I think, is the claim of innocence, which I don't think holds much truth after 200 years of being here and interacting with Indigenous people. It's fairly easy to access resources about country now because there are so many Indigenous scholars and elders and community leaders who are generating information accessible online and in all sorts of places. It really does start at home. I remember a conversation many years ago with the Age journalist Martin Flanagan, and he was talking about his friend Neil Murray, who went up to the Northern Territory to look for Australia and himself, and Indigenous Australia in particular. And Martin said that after this journey that Neil went on, he came home to the Western districts of Victoria and discovered that all the answers were at home. So I think, you know, the building blocks for the kind of things that everyone on this panel is talking about starts at home. And one of the key, I guess, activities I asked my first year students to undertake is find out the place where you live and what that means for the local Indigenous people. And I think, you know, if you start at home, those things that Bruce was talking about in terms of love of country become possibilities. You know, I'm proudly someone whose family comes from Central Australia, but I'm also conscious of the need to understand my place with Victorian peoples who are my hosts. I'm on their country. So I need to understand what my place is in that context. And if we can do that, I think this is particularly a Victorian disease. Victorians think that Indigenous people exist somewhere up north. We need to start at home as a community.
Thank you so much, Barry. Nari, do you have any thoughts on that one about how we should share knowledges to assist non-Indigenous peoples to also help us care for country?
Yeah, definitely. I think we have to be careful what we're talking about when we talk about Indigenous knowledges and which knowledges we're talking about. Because I think, you know, as we've said tonight, it is really important to understand the knowledge of country and where you live and where you're from, and to listen to First Nations communities of your local area, which means, you know, looking at all those resources. As Barry said, there's so many resources now on social media, you know, even through the Victorian government pages now, where there's a lot of collaboration with community organisations to create resources that are written by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that live on this country. So I think those are the resources we should be using, and I think we should be also acknowledging the land and understanding that, you know, a lot of the knowledges that are taught in universities do come from Indigenous knowledges. But I do think, you know, there's definitely knowledges that are actually sacred and that are for First Nations people only. And I think that needs to be respected. And I think that comes down to understanding your position as a non-Indigenous person and understanding how to be an ally in that space. And I don't even know if I like the term ally, but, you know, it is a term that is used often, I guess, to try and define that notion of knowing your place on this land. In the same way that I know my place, I know that I'm a guest on Wurundjeri country when I'm there. I know that I'm not from that country. And I also know when I'm on my country that I'm also junior in that community kinship process. And I would listen to my elders and my aunties and my uncles and my, you know, senior knowledge advisors. So I think you have to think about what knowledges you're talking about and what, you know, is appropriate to share, and what is actually, you know, as a non-Indigenous person, respectful to actually step back and say, actually, that's not for me to know. And actually, I don't have to take, all knowledges away from First Nations people in order to understand, the country that I'm on and, the environment that is around me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nari. And I think going back to what you were saying before about the way that the trees work around that medicine example that you used, our Indigenous knowledge systems work holistically, and often the knowledges cannot be separated from one another. And I think that's an important idea that can sometimes be hard to grapple with for non-Indigenous mob who, when we talk about cultural burning, there's such a resurgence as of late to implement that back on country. And I think without the other systems that sit alongside that, we may not see the value of that, or it may be different to the way it was intended. So I think coming back to those, interrelated holistic systems that are unique to country and need to be considered in that way. I have one final question for the panel, and I'd love to hear from everyone if that's okay. And I apologise for going a little bit over. We've just had such insightful conversation happening. It's been hard to interrupt. We've also had Maddie drop off, unfortunately. So it's just the 4 remaining. But my final question, and this coming back to, our purpose, our, celebration during NAIDOC as mob, what are your aspirations for country? What would you like as First Nations people to see for your country, for country that you feel connected to? What are your aspirations? Anyone want to kick us off for this final question? Deepa, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I can kick off. In many respects, I think it's important to hold a mirror up to the society in which we live and to showcase who we are and to be reflected back through the country in which we are located. And, this idea of showcasing and celebrating culture and country is something that I'm particularly interested in, and moving beyond the sort of deficit discourse of how we frame the connection to Indigenous culture. And that to me is really about normalising that relationality to country. And that to me is really the powerful next step, is to embrace that as part of the normative experience as we traverse through the places and spaces. And it can be as simple as, the use of dual language. We see it in other contexts, in New Zealand, for instance, where, it just becomes embedded as sort of the way in which we engage. And, what better way, and they exist already, a lot of the suburbs and the national parks and so forth are named using, Indigenous language, but it's just bringing that to the fore and starting to engage with it. And I think also just understanding that acute responsibility that we have, given some of the real fundamental and existential challenges that befall us, we need to act now. And engaging in partnership with Indigenous people is integral. We only constitute 3% of the population, so we have to do this in collaboration and together. But understanding that shared connection is the means to start to unify in a shared purpose, and that ultimately there is an urgency to it as well.
Thank you, Deepa. Barry, do you have a response to that one? What your aspirations for country and healing country are? It's a big one.
Very quickly, I think to lend support to Bruce's idea that the Uluru Statement becomes our national anthem, and that lawmen, old men and old women who hold so much knowledge, that knowledge is recognised and given the respect that it deserves and is given value in the world.
Thanks, Barry. Nari?
Look, I'd probably say some things that are very much on similar lines, but really my aspiration is to see genuine collaboration with traditional owner groups to ensure that country is actually looked after in the right way. And again, the only way we're going to do that is if we acknowledge where the knowledge has come from and the practices that have been practiced for thousands of years. And really my overall aspiration is actually to see our country thriving, not just surviving. And that's the only way we can do that is by actually making sure that community are actively involved and have a really clear voice. And that is happening partly through the treaty process and partly through some of these commissions that are being stood up. But we still have a bit of a way to go. And again, that comes down to non-Indigenous people valuing Indigenous knowledges and First Nations peoples of this country and understanding that history and healing that shared history that we have.
Thank you so much. And finally, Uncle Bruce, some final thoughts from you.
You know, Nari touched on it before. When we're sharing country, we don't give it all away. You know, there is a law and it pertains to Aboriginal people and Aboriginal people's connection to land. But there are elements of it that can be shared. But there's also that other element to it that our own people, Aboriginal people of Australia, we have to make that connection too. We just can't assume that just because we're black or just because we've got Aboriginal family, that we can assume that connection to country. We have to make that connection to country. And the obligation to care for mother is upon us too. We just can't sit back and, you know, grizzle about what has been done to country if we're not actively involved in caring for her. So the chance to be a knowledge holder comes with an enormous responsibility. We can share elements of it, and I think we can teach non-Aboriginal Australians not to be greedy, you know, to accept that this is Aboriginal land and it can be shared, but there's an element of it which is retained within country and within people. But our own people can't avoid the responsibility of caring for land too. And that's perhaps what NAIDOC Week was all about originally. It was about our own people celebrating. These days, it's about everybody celebrating. And, you know, it makes it a really busy week for everybody. But we can't shirk that. We can't turn our back on it. Because if non-Aboriginal people want to know, we've been asking that for 250 years. The very first day on the beach, we were inviting people to welcome people to country. That offer was refused. But 250 years later, if we don't accept that interest, that desire to know country, then I think we will have done damage.
Thank you so much, Uncle Bruce, and thank you all for all your insights and conversation. I love the opportunity to yarn with Mob. I learned so much and feel my cultural knowledge just expanding within this yarning session. So thank you so much for being here. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and apologies for going over time. This will be made as a recording and will be available if you want to have another listen and share with anyone else. But as Uncle Bruce was saying, you know, NAIDOC is also, you know, about Mob and Mob celebrating. So I just want to wish you all a happy NAIDOC Mob and hope you have a great week, and we'll speak soon. So thank you everyone so much.
Thank you everyone.